to make a bit of a caveat. These are my views and not those of the FBI per se. The faults are mine, most definitely. And, if there's any benefit out of that, they hired me, so at least they made a good choice out of it. But what I'd like to do, and I think this is what Beverly wanted me to talk about, was the impact of this on the FBI. And I think to do that, what I need to do is cover a little bit about the state of the Bureau before all this is going on. Because, of course, you may get a hint at it, but my colleagues have certainly talked about things that would have an impact on changing the FBI, regardless of whether the church committee ever happened. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about what the church committee intended to do, what they did, and of course, what they recommended should be done. And if you've seen, especially their book 2 of the final report about domestic intelligence in the U.S., they make some 96 suggestions. So there's quite a little bit that they wanted to see done. And then we can talk about how that has kind of come through the recent years, to the present, how that has impacted the FBI, whether those changes are permanent or not, or whether they were effective. And I've got obviously some opinions there, and I'm happy to share them. So, with that said, of course, the early 1970s, the FBI was in a state of significant change. Hoover had just died in 1972, May 2nd. He'd been director for 48 years. Obviously, he was, in many ways, the institution, both for good and bad. And you could tell that the questioning of Hoover's reign had been coming on for a long time at that point. And there was a lot going on. 1971, of course, you had the break-in in the FBI's Media Pennsylvania resident agency, and hundreds of documents were stolen, revealing publicly for the first time the codename COINTELPRO, which nobody knew what it was. Carl Stern, the reporter for NBC, asked the FBI what it was and got a reply along the lines of, well, it was a very sensitive program that ended and we're not going to say anything more about it. So he sued. And over the next couple of years, of course, revelations about what COINTELPRO were started to drip out. The Department of Justice was, of course, forced to conduct its own investigation of it and make those revelations in 1974. And of course, it also leads to significant changes in the way the FBI handles the Freedom of Information Act. And we'll be talking about that, of course, as we go along. 1974, of course, we have Seymour Hersh's article, as Laura talked well about. And it kind of starts off this whole move to have this Senate committee that will address problems in the intelligence community. Within a month, the Senate Resolution 21 is passed, and the committee is tasked with looking at the illegal, improper, or unethical activities of the government intelligence agencies, especially with regards to domestic Americans. What are they doing at home? And not surprisingly, of course, the FBI is going to be front and center of this. But if we look at it over the next couple of months, of course, the public look at it seems to be they're going to focus more on the CIA. And not a lot starts to seem to come out about the FBI at the time. Church, of course, was immediately selected as the head, and within a day or two, he was telling the New York Times that the new Senate Select Committee on Intelligence would examine charges that the CIA, FBI, and perhaps other government information gathering agencies have exceeded the statutory limits on their authority. The task will be to balance legitimate national security interests with the right of the people to know what, if any, transgressions have taken place. I think Fred Schwartz, the counsel, in commenting in his recent book that just came out about the purpose of the committee, added kind of that emotional weight to it too, and said, I saw my main job as exposing illegal and embarrassing secrets in order to build momentum for reform. So we've kind of got both of these things going on, obviously. On the one hand, Church, of course, is saying we still need an intelligence community. We're going to need one. But it's done some wrong things, and we have to figure out what those are and how to correct that so that they don't happen again. Obviously, a laboratory goal. So, how does the administration look at this? Well, the FBI, of course, over January, February, March, begins compiling just some basic documentation. It's never been good at looking at its own history. It didn't have a historian, didn't have a historical program. As far as the last historical monograph that had truly been written of a program of the FBI's. It was the history of its Special Intelligence Service during World War II, which ended in 1947. So self-reflection was not one of our strong points. But the administration is concerned. Foreign Relations to the U.S. State Department just put out a volume on making a foreign policy in this period, and has a nice section on the church committee. Regrettably, I found out about it this week, so I only had a chance to read the first couple of memos. But clearly, the administration was concerned. How do we deal with this? What are we going to do? Secretary Kinzinger was worried about whether or not the NSA was going to take a big hit in it. Deputy Attorney General Silberman commented instead, no, the FBI may be the sexiest part of this. Hoover did things that won't stand scrutiny, especially under Johnson. We will put these out in generic terms as quickly as possible. The Bureau would like to dribble it out. This will divert attention and sow relative cooperation with the committee. This relates only to illegal activity. So obviously, they were starting to consider how do we deal with this. And of course, like Washington is in politics, it's what part of the story do you tell, how often do you tell it, where do you tell it, why do you tell it, and what's going to happen out of it. So, continues to grow. In November of 1975, of course, the committee first turns publicly to the FBI. It had already done a lot of background interviews, it had been collecting documents, obviously sending Ethan out to do the research that would lead to his career at Marquette and to, of course, our benefit as historians here. But their questions had been limited. They had asked about the Kennedy assassination of one former official. They asked Sam Papich, who was our liaison to the CIA for years, about FBI-CIA relationships. Looked to be really intelligence focused. By the time the November hearings come around, the focus, of course, is COINTELPRO. The Attorney General's reports come out. The FBI has been forced to release some 50,000 pages of documents under the Freedom of Information Act. That was the first. As Ethan noted, the FBI prior to that had not released information, considered itself exempt because of various reasons, and the courts were beginning to say no. In fact, we were already involved in a number of suits, both related to the Freedom of Information Act as well as in relation to some of our earlier surveillance practices that had been coming out in relation to the Watergate hearings and things like that. One young girl had sued us because the FBI had opened her mail that she sent to the Socialist Workers' Party for a school project, and they wanted her file purged. Not surprising. We were being sued by the Socialist Workers' Party at that point for some of the investigations that had been done. And of course, many of the COINTELPRO actions over the years have been taken against Socialist Workers' Party, many of the bad jobs that Ethan noted, of course, had as well. So that was in there, and of course, it meant a lot of discovery in court. So all these things are going on, even as churches interacting. We're brought to task for surveillance of citizens and groups, especially Dr. King. And of course, one of the Bureau officials who was questioned was a man named William Sullivan, who during the 60s was a senior FBI official. He eventually got drummed out of the Bureau, but he was involved in sending a package of tapes of FBI surveillance of Dr. King at a motel to the family house, along with the letter that Beverly, of course, has recently written about, suggesting that King should get out of the business. Some people have taken it as a suicide note. Regardless, it was obviously over and above anything the FBI should have been remotely connected to. Of course, had it come out during Hoover's day, Hoover should have been fired, regardless of whether he was protected over the years. But when it came out in the mid-70s, it did a lot, obviously, to affect the reputation of the FBI. Political uses of FBI intelligence investigations, in other words, working especially with Nixon and Johnson over the years, had come out. Unjustified intelligence investigations that the church committee said you allowed. And of course, a number of administrative things, FBI records practices and certain investigative practices were all focused in these hearings. Of course, if you look at the actual published hearings, volume 6 on the FBI is the thickest of the bunch. And it has a lot of FBI documents. Again, these are things that people have never seen before. the FBI considered its records sacrosanct. Whether it was, this typewriter receipt, we just bought this typewriter, or it was, we just broke into the Socialist Workers' Party and found these documents. So the church committee was airing, obviously, Hoover's dirty laundry, but it went beyond that, of course, because it touched on, in a sense, the way the FBI had seen itself, what the FBI had done all through those years. So, the next year, 1976, early 76, the church committee is supposed to report. They end up taking a number of extensions. The report ends up coming out in late April. And when it's released, the impact doesn't seem to appear right away. One New York Times reporter suggests that, it kind of came in with this big wave of scandal and, news conferences and people really chomping at the bit to get at these intelligence agencies and the abuses. And it's kind of going down more with a whimper here. And yet, if we look at the recommendations, we look at the report, I think there is something deeper there. The committee said that it found that actions by the intelligence community and other government entities had infringed on the rights and liberties of Americans. Even incidentally, fear of domestic intelligence, it suggested, had an impact on the way people exercise their First Amendment rights, and so was a worrying thing. So not just direct action, but even knowledge of that has an impact. And so the committee made 96 recommendations. More than half of them were directly aimed at the FBI. In general, they had a couple principles in making these recommendations. They said that action that directly infringes on First Amendment rights has to be prohibited. And they saw COINTELPRO, obviously, in this light. They wanted the government, where it did things that might have an impact on someone's First Amendment rights, a collateral impact, to use a means test, much like Supreme Court First Amendment decisions. It had to show compelling government need, had to minimize the impact. And, of course, they wanted procedural safeguards, things like higher officials, Attorney General, President signing off on these things. They wanted congressional notification. And of course, this was very key in the whole issue of covert action, especially with the CIA. Congressional notification was to be key. Congress was supposed to be playing a role. And in part, this is where I diverge a little bit from my fellow panelists. In part, the lack of oversight, I think, had to do with a inherent understanding of the role of intelligence and executive power. The problem in the 60s is the intelligence practices weren't simply being aimed abroad. Of course, they never completely were. Intelligence practices have been used in America against American citizens for many years before that. But it really came to a fore because of the radicalization of the anti-war and civil rights movements and the government's overreaction to those, because of the turn of violence in some of those movements. Of course, in the 1970s, we had the emergence of the Weather Underground and Sudanese Liberation Army. People aren't simply burning draft cards, they're throwing bombs. So this change has focused us here at home, focused us here in America. And that, of course, again, is why the FBI really comes to the fore in these things. So,
I'm giving you your 2 minute mark.
2 minutes, thank you. So, church committee is not supposed to say no domestic investigations, but rather that they need to be limited. So, is the FBI limited? Well, not by a legislative charter. And of course, that is the biggest proposal coming out of this. But the effects of that legislative charter do come through the Attorney General guidelines issued in March, just before the report comes out, but really built on much of what church is proposing. And those guidelines have carried through. They're a public statement of how the FBI should work. Does it perfectly follow them? Obviously not. There have been obvious reports over the years. Sometimes the guidelines have been tweaked because of policy issues, but overall, it is a permanent feature of how the FBI does business. That is a significant change, I think. FISA, I think, is another one. For years, the general assumption had been foreign intelligence, electronic surveillance is an issue of executive authority, and that's it. but now we have court oversight. So where church was very concerned about checks and balances, those are starting to come in. And the creation of a permanent Senate Intelligence Committee is again another check. You know, the fact that we have regular hearings, the fact that the intelligence community is called to the carpet for Iran-Contra, the FBI is called to the carpet for the investigation of committing solidarity with the people of El Salvador, assistance in the 80s. So that suggests changes. These are things that didn't happen before 1976, but they are things that happen now. FBI agents were prosecuted for break-ins, and two of them were actually convicted, Mark Felt and William Miller. That's a change. FBI agents hadn't been convicted for those things before, and so on. I think that the church committee, although it didn't get what it wanted, it did affect many of the changes that it was looking for. So in a sense, it's not business as usual, but sometimes it does rhyme with it.